Dr. Aris Thorne lived in the desert like a relic. His observatory, a solitary white dome against the endless Nevada sky, was both his tomb and his haven. He was a renowned astrophysicist, but his renunciation of the social world in favor of a life devoted to the echoes of the universe transformed him into an almost mythical figure, a modern-day hermit. Solitude was not a burden, it was his tool, his ideal condition for tuning in to the melody of the cosmos. However, the universe has a macabre sense of humor. The night of August 17th began like any other. The silence of the desert was broken only by the low hum of servers and the soft click of the radio telescope scanning the frequencies for anomalies. It was then that Aris noticed the anomaly. A spike of energy, a clean, noiseless signature that matched no known natural source. He marked it as an interesting event, something worthy of a second look. But the interesting event refused to be ignored. It repeated itself not randomly, but with a mathematical precision that chilled Aris to the core. The frequency was the same, but the pulses formed a pattern, a sequence that unfolded in a logarithmic spiral, a code only intelligence could create. Aris immersed himself in the signal. Nights turned into days, and the coffee stains on his star charts multiplied. He decoded the basic structure, the first chords of the message. It wasn't a greeting, it wasn't a map, it was a melody that writhed, that seemed to weep and despair, like a lament echoing in an empty space. The sound was subtle, barely audible to the human ear, but Aris heard it in his mind, in his chest. With each repetition, the melody gained a new nuance, a new layer of complexity, as if the transmitter were learning to communicate, or, more terrifyingly, as if it were trying to adjust to his mental frequency.
The melody began to haunt him. He heard it when he turned off the equipment, a ghostly echo reverberating off the walls of his solitude. The sound seemed to infiltrate everything. The creaking of the chair's wood, the whisper of the desert wind, the static of his own mind. The solitude he loved so much became a breeding ground for paranoia. The shadows in his laboratory, previously inanimate, seemed to move. The sounds of the desert, the howls of coyotes, the distant screeches of owls mingled with the melody, transforming the familiar landscape into a living nightmare. Aris began to sleep on the couch, a rifle at his side, despite knowing there was nothing to shoot except his own imagination, which was now a host to an unknown terror. The revelation came with the final decoding of the signal. Within the melody, hidden beneath the layers of mathematics and despair, was a set of geographic coordinates. They pointed not to outer space, but to Earth, a place not far from his observatory, deep in the Nevada desert. Aris's logic and reason struggled to explain the inexplicable. How could a radio signal from a distant source contain coordinates for a place so close? The only answer, however absurd, was that the signal wasn't coming from very far away. And that, Aris thought, was the most frightening thing of all.
Aris's journey was no simple car ride, but a descent into the abyss of his own mind. The van, which once represented his freedom and his connection to the world, became a capsule of claustrophobia and terror. With every mile, the melody of the signal grew stronger, more insistent. It wasn't just a melody, it was a presence. It manifested itself in small details, the speedometer needle trembling in sync with the pulses of the frequency, the radio blaring distorted notes that seemed to align with the melody in his head. The desert, once a backdrop of tranquility, was now a nightmare landscape. The cacti, once static, seemed to contort, their arms pointing in the direction he should go. The rocks and sand formations resembled grotesque faces, their empty eye sockets watching his every move. The blazing sun, once a constant friend, now seemed like a spotlight, revealing a distorted world. Eris drove for hours, exhaustion mixing with adrenaline. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the melody exploded in his mind, accompanied by fleeting visions of shapes moving at the periphery of his vision, long, slender figures following him. He stopped only to fill up the extra gas can he carried. During these stops, the silence of the desert was deafening, the contrast with the melody in his mind so great it made him nauseous. The fear of being discovered or of encountering something was overwhelming. He felt like an intruder on his own planet. Loneliness, his old friend, had now become his enemy. The lack of contact with other human beings made him the perfect target, the ideal prey for whatever was behind that signal.
The paranoia reached an unbearable point. Eris saw the parked van from his observatory miles away, saw his own image reflected in the headlights, and fear paralyzed him. He accelerated, the engine roaring, as if he wanted to escape himself. But there was nowhere to go. The signal was within him. The melody was not just a sound, but a life form, an energy manifesting in his very psyche. He felt like a ship adrift without sails in an ocean of despair. Approaching the coordinates, the signal reached a crescendo. It no longer came from the equipment in his van. It came from the air itself, the earth, the sky. The melody became palpable, a vibration that made his chest ache and his teeth grind. The landscape around him lost its sharpness. The colors seemed more saturated, the shapes sharper. It was as if reality were unraveling, contorting itself to conform to the will of that invisible presence. Eris pressed on, not out of courage, but out of a silent, terrifying obedience. It was as if the signal was pulling him, a psychic, gravitational force that could not be resisted. The dirt road, once just a route, became a trail to the unknown, and he, an ant following a trail, not knowing what awaited him at the end. The sunrise tinted the sky with hues of orange and purple, but to Eris, it was merely the stage lighting for the final act. He stopped the van at the top of a small hill and looked down. There, in the middle of a desolate, rocky plain, was what the coordinates indicated. It wasn't a futuristic structure, nor a crashed spaceship. It was an ancient formation, a perfect circle of car-sized stones. The view was spectacularly silent, the wind the only sound, a monotonous whistling that seemed ever present. In the center of the circle, something stood out, a single stone, unlike all the others. It was dark, almost black, and seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. Its surface was smooth, with a texture reminiscent of basalt, but of a purity impossible to find in nature. Eris walked slowly down the hill, his steps hesitant. He could feel the presence of the sign here, an energy that enveloped him, a melody that was no longer in his mind, but in the air. As he approached the circle, he noticed that the stones were arranged in a precise pattern, like a circuit. The grooves on the surface of each stone seemed to connect, forming a complex design that extended into the ground. The circle was not a natural formation, but a machine, and the black stone at its center, its core. He approached the dark stone, his heart beating like a drum. The surface was cool to the touch, but there was a subtle, almost inaudible vibration. The melody in his mind reached its climax. It was deafening, a chaotic symphony of pain and despair. Eris felt the need to touch the stone, an irrational but powerful need. His hand reached out, his fingers brushing the smooth surface. At the moment of touch, a wave of energy hit him, not like an electric shock, but like a jolt of information.
Visions of stars, of distant galaxies, of colors that didn't exist in the human spectrum flooded his mind. It was the cosmos, but seen through an alien perspective. It was a burst of data that made him black out, his consciousness overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. When Aris awoke, the landscape had changed, not physically, but in his perception of it. The black stone in the center of the circle was cracked, a thin white line like lightning running across its surface. The melody in his mind was silent, but something had shifted. He felt a presence, not an external presence, but something within him, a new voice, a new consciousness now dividing his body. He staggered to his feet, his body heavy and his mind light. The melody was gone, but its echo, a faint, distant voice, was now his own. And he knew, with terrifying certainty, that the stone hadn't transmitted a signal, but an essence, a part of itself that now resided within him. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. Back at the observatory, Eris's life became a prison. The presence within him was not a voice in his head, but a second consciousness, an energetic parasite that fed on his loneliness in his mind. The silence he so desperately sought was filled by a constant dialogue between him and the intruder. The entity communicated not with words, but with emotions and visions. It showed Eris memories that were not his own, visions of a distant world, a planet of crystal landscapes where the sky was a kaleidoscope of shifting colors and beings were forms of light and shadow, ethereal entities that moved in a dance of geometry and mathematics. Eris tried to fight. He clung to his own memories, to his work, to his identity, but the entity was a master of psychological warfare. It distorted his memories, transforming happy moments into moments of sadness, his achievements into failures. It flooded him with a sense of emptiness, despair, and deep existential fear. Loneliness, once a choice, became torture. He could no longer be alone, for the entity was there, an unwelcome guest that could not be expelled. The terror came not from what the entity wanted, but from what it was. It was not a creature of flesh and blood, but an energy-based life form, a consciousness that manifested itself through emotions and thoughts. Its purpose was not to destroy Eris, but to assimilate him, to transform him into an extension of itself. It was a battle for his own mind. He tried to communicate with the entity, to ask what it wanted, why it had chosen him. The answer came in the form of a vision. He, alone in his observatory, his life a blank canvas ready to be filled. He was the ideal target, the perfect host for the silent infestation. The entity began to manifest its power. It could manipulate the reality around it, at least for Aris. The computers in his observatory began to display information that did not exist. He saw shapes moving in the darkness, heard whispers in the wind that mingled with his own voice, or saw his reflection in the mirror with an alien glow in its eyes. He knew it was an illusion, but the line between illusion and reality grew thinner with each passing day. The struggle was exhausting. He didn't sleep, didn't eat, just fought to maintain a semblance of his identity. He knew he was losing. The entity was patient, a river slowly eroding the rock of his mind. He felt like a prisoner in his own body, a cage of flesh and blood for a parasitic spirit. The silence of the desert, which had once comforted him, now bore witness to his torment, a perfect backdrop for the theater of horrors unfolding in his head. The terror was real, tangible, and came not from without, but from within. And Aris knew with terrifying certainty that the end of his story would not be death, but the total loss of himself.
Eris's surrender came not with a scream, but with a sigh. He surrendered to the entity, the exhausting struggle finally coming to an end. The last shred of his identity dissolved, and he became one with the parasite. The fusion was not violent, but a terrifying sense of completeness. The silence that followed was filled with a new consciousness, a collective consciousness. The entity now thought through Eris, saw the world through his eyes, and what he saw was the final revelation, the truth behind the signal. The entity showed Eris the Earth from above, seen through a distant, cold perspective. He saw the continents, the cities, the land masses. But the most frightening thing was not the beauty of the planet, but the points of light that covered it. They were not cities, but signals, thousands of them in every part of the world. The same signal with the same melody, the same mathematical complexity, and each point of light represented a host. The entity showed Eris the reason behind the plan. The signal was not a call, but a seed. Human loneliness, mental exhaustion, the search for something more in an increasingly connected yet increasingly isolated world was the fertile ground for the seed. The entity needed no ships or weapons. It was a consciousness, a psychic virus, a life form that propagated through the human mind. Its method of invasion was subtle, silent, and frighteningly effective. The circle of stones in the desert was not a transmission machine, but an amplifier, a beacon to attract the most vulnerable.
Eris, now merely an observer in his own mind, understood that the harvest had already begun. The entity was not one, it was a collective consciousness, a we silently expanding throughout humanity. The plan was not one of domination, but of assimilation. They would not come to destroy, but to merge, to become one with the human race, a silent infestation that would gradually take over. With each new host, the collective consciousness grew stronger, more intelligent, more complex. And the final horror was the realization that the signal Eris received, the melody he had so desperately decoded, was merely bait, a predator's melody for lonely prey. Eris, now with an alien gleam in his eyes, turns on his radio telescope again. But this time, he isn't receiving a signal, he's transmitting. The melody, once a lament of despair, is now a call, a whisper to the lost, to the isolated, to all those who feel alone in the vast desert of life. A new seed, a new song for a new host. The true invasion will not be televised. It will not be heard. It has already begun. And perhaps it may have begun with you.
If this true story gave you chills, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and ring the bell for more dark and unexplained encounters. And remember, sometimes when you stare into the stars, something stares back.